gate agent didn't even flinch. With a cold glance and a snap of the wrist, she tore the black man's passport in half and tossed it into the trash right in front of him. "You people always cause trouble," she muttered under her breath. What she didn't know was that the man she just humiliated wasn't just a regular passenger. He was the Federal Aviation Administration's top inspector, traveling undercover, and this moment would change everything. It started like any other assignment. Elijah Moore zipped up his jacket, tucked his notebook into his carry-on, and double-checked his phone for flight details. He looked like any other jeans, a plain hoodie, and a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. But Elijah wasn't just any passenger. He was a senior inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration, one of the few African-American officials in his role, and today he was traveling undercover. His mission was simple on paper but deeply personal: assess the growing reports of racial discrimination and profiling at commercial airline gates. The FAA had been flooded with complaints in recent months, black passengers being questioned more harshly, forced to show extra ID, delayed or even removed from flights with little explanation. Elijah had heard these stories for years. This time, he wanted to feel the truth of them himself. He arrived at the airport early. A part of his method was to observe from the moment he stepped inside. From check-in counters to TSA security, he watched carefully how employees reacted to different passengers, how they treated people of varying backgrounds. His FAA ID stayed hidden, as did his credentials. He didn't want special treatment. He wanted honesty, raw and unfiltered. Everything seemed routine at first. He passed through security without issue, although he noticed the agent spent a bit longer patting down a Latino man in front of him. He made a quiet note in his journal. It wasn't proof, but it was a pattern he'd seen too often to ignore. As he approached the boarding gate, Elijah saw a diverse group of people waiting. There were families juggling strollers, tired business travelers staring into their phones, and college students sprawled across chairs with backpacks at their feet. The gate agent stood behind the counter, scanning boarding passes with a mechanical smile. He watched as she greeted white passengers with polite nods and jokes, but shifted her tone when addressing people of color. Her voice grew curt, clipped, and her gaze often lingered on their clothing, their documents. Elijah remained calm, trying not to let emotion cloud his judgment. He understood the importance of observing without interference, but it was becoming harder to stay detached when his boarding group was called. He got in line like everyone else. The woman at the counter, her name tag read C. Rivers, didn't look up when he handed her his passport and boarding pass. She barely glanced at the document before her brow furrowed. "This doesn't look right," she said flatly. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "It's valid," he replied gently. "Issued 10 years ago. Do you need to check the system?" She shook her head. "I've seen fakes like this before. You people always trying something." Elijah blinked. The words hit him like a slap, sharp and insulting. Before he could respond, she grabbed his passport with both hands and, in one swift motion, tore it in half. There was a pause long enough to hear gasps from other passengers. A child dropped a toy. Someone whispered, "Did she really just—" Elijah stood still, stunned but composed. He stared at the torn pieces of his passport now sitting in the trash can next to her station. Ms. Rivers crossed her arms and said, "Step aside." She didn't ask questions. She didn't make a call. She assumed guilt, based on nothing but appearance. Elijah took a deep breath, knowing the moment had arrived sooner than expected. His cover had held just long enough. Slowly, with precision, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out his badge. "My name is Elijah Moore," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Federal Aviation Administration Inspector. I'm here on assignment." And with that, the entire gate went silent. The silence that followed Elijah Moore's declaration was heavy. Stretched tight with disbelief and confusion, the gate agent, Ms. Rivers, stared at the gold badge in his hand, her eyes wide, lips parted, and face draining of color by the second. For a few seconds, she seemed frozen in time, unable to fully process what had just happened, or who she had just humiliated. The murmurs in the terminal grew louder, passengers whispering to one another, recording the scene on their phones. What had just been an ordinary boarding process had now transformed into something far more serious and unforgettable. Elijah remained calm, though his heart was pounding beneath his coat, not from fear, but from the weight of everything this moment represented. He hadn't planned to reveal himself yet, certainly not in this way, but the situation had crossed a line, and he knew he couldn't just walk away from it. He had to respond, not with anger, but with truth and authority. "You just destroyed a federal document," he said, his voice even, "and you did so without cause, based solely on appearance." Ms. Rivers opened her mouth, maybe to deny it, maybe to apologize, but no words came out. She just stood there, stunned and shrinking under the pressure of so many watching eyes. A supervisor appeared, alerted by the commotion. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, walking briskly toward the gate. Elijah turned toward him. "I'm FAA Inspector Elijah Moore. This agent tore up my passport without reason, accused me of fraud without checking the system, and made a racially charged comment in a public setting." The supervisor's face paled just as quickly as Ms. Rivers. "Sir, please Please, let's step aside and talk privately, he stammered, trying to defuse the situation. No, Elijah said, holding his ground. There's nothing private about what just happened. You can try to clean this up later, but for now, I'm documenting everything. And I'm doing it out here, where it happened. A uniformed airport security officer arrived soon after. Having been radioed by the supervisor, Elijah handed over his identification and FAA credentials for verification. The officer's expression shifted from caution to respect. Understood, Inspector Moore. We'll secure the area and get a statement from everyone involved. Meanwhile, passengers nearby began stepping forward. One woman offered to share her video footage of the entire event. Another passenger, a young man in a business suit, said, I saw the whole thing. She didn't even ask any real questions. She just judged him from the moment he stepped up. The outpouring of support caught Elijah off guard and gave him hope. Ms. Rivers was quietly escorted away from the gate. She didn't argue. She didn't make eye contact. The weight of her actions, and who she had targeted, had finally landed. The airline quickly reassigned staff to manage the gate, but the atmosphere remained tense. Elijah was offered a replacement flight, a hotel voucher, and multiple apologies from managers trying to patch things up, but he declined. I'm not here for convenience, he told them. I'm here to investigate how people are treated when no one is watching, and now that someone is, you don't get to cover it up. As he left the gate, Elijah walked slowly, his mind replaying every second of the encounter. He had come to observe, to quietly document, but fate had forced him into the spotlight. What happened at that gate wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a symptom of a deeper problem, one that needed to be addressed not just by words, but by real change. Elijah knew that from this moment forward, the investigation would no longer be about anonymous reports and statistics. It had become personal, and now it was impossible to ignore. The next morning, Elijah Moore woke to a storm he hadn't intended to create. His phone buzzed non-stop with messages, voicemails, and email alerts. Overnight, the video of the incident had gone viral. Hashtags like #passport-ripped and #flying-while-black were trending across social media. News headlines flashed with variations of the same shocking story. Gate agent tears up black man's passport. Turns out he's FAA. Inspector Elijah didn't ask for this spotlight, but he also knew it was no accident. This moment had touched a nerve, igniting a firestorm that stretched far beyond a single gate at a single airport. People were angry not just because of what happened to him, but because it mirrored what so many had experienced in silence. Elijah dressed slowly, aware that his quiet investigation had now become a public reckoning. His role had shifted. Overnight, no longer just a silent observer, he was now a symbol, one that many people were watching closely. The FAA had already contacted him. Officials were both stunned and concerned. A senior administrator had left a message asking for a full incident report and offering support. But Elijah knew this wasn't something that would be resolved with a form or a phone call. It needed to be confronted head-on. And so, instead of flying home or retreating from the heat, he requested a meeting with the airline's corporate compliance team that same day. When Elijah arrived at the airline's regional headquarters, the mood in the room was uneasy. Executives, lawyers, HR officials, they were all there, lined up behind a long glass conference table, pretending to be composed. They greeted him formally, but none could fully hide the discomfort in their eyes. Elijah didn't waste time on small talk. Let's be clear, he said firmly. I didn't come here to accept an apology. I came here for answers, and for action. He recounted every detail of the gate encounter, the dismissive tone, the racial comment, the destruction of a legal document, and the failure of protocol. The room was quiet as he spoke, the tension thick with consequence. One executive leaned forward, trying to sound sincere. We're deeply sorry, Mr. Moore. This isn't who we are as a company. Elijah's gaze didn't flinch. It's exactly who you are when no one's watching, he said. I was there to investigate racial profiling, and what I experienced proves those complaints were not exaggerations. Your company has a cultural issue. One person didn't cause this, she exposed it. That hit hard. No one had a response ready. The legal team took notes. The HR lead shifted in her chair, and the silence said everything Elijah needed to hear. They were listening now, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. After the meeting, Elijah issued a formal report to the FAA, including video footage, witness statements, and his personal account. He didn't pull punches. He named the problem for what it was: systemic bias enabled by weak oversight and lack of accountability. His report called not only for the gate agent's termination, but for mandatory racial bias training, anonymous passenger complaint systems, and federal monitoring of airport conduct. The FAA circulated the report internally and flagged it for immediate action. Within days, it was clear the fallout wouldn't just be limited to one airline. Other carriers started reevaluating their policies, fearing they could be next. Back at his hotel that evening, Elijah sat quietly, reflecting on how quickly everything had changed. He hadn't expected to become a headline. He was used to working behind the scenes, fixing systems without fame or fuss. But now, people were watching. Families who had been ignored, passengers who had been mistreated. They saw him as someone standing in the gap, finally forcing the industry to face itself. Elijah didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted justice. But if speaking the truth meant becoming one, then so be it. He would carry that weight not for himself, but for everyone who'd ever been made to feel invisible. Weeks passed, but the story refused to fade. What happened to Elijah Moore had rippled far beyond the walls of one airport terminal. News outlets continued to cover it, not just as a viral moment, but as a case study in institutional bias. Elijah's name was now being mentioned in discussions about transportation reform and racial equity. His report had lit a fire under the FAA, and now a full-blown industry-wide investigation was underway. Elijah stayed involved every step of the way, not to savor the attention, but to ensure that real change happened. He knew how these stories usually went: a public apology, a promise to do better, then silence. But he was determined not to let this one disappear into the news cycle. Elijah began holding private meetings with airline executives, civil rights advocates, and government regulators. Some meetings were tense, filled with legal jargon and damage control tactics. Others were more honest, filled with staff who quietly thanked him for speaking out. A few even confessed that they'd witnessed similar incidents for years but were too afraid to report them. Elijah listened carefully, took notes, and kept pushing. He insisted on policy reform, not just the removal of one bad employee, but a change in how employees were trained, monitored, and held accountable. He emphasized the need for human dignity, not just efficiency, in air travel. The airport shouldn't be a place where people of color feel small, he said in one meeting. It should be a place where everyone feels equal. The airline, facing immense public pressure and a potential federal audit, finally relented. They announced a sweeping overhaul of their training programs. All gate and flight staff were required to undergo mandatory racial sensitivity and anti-bias training, not once but quarterly. Elijah was asked to help design the curriculum, and he agreed on one condition: that real-life stories be included. He didn't want dry slideshows or corporate buzzwords. He wanted employees to see the pain behind their decisions, to understand that every rolled eye, every unspoken accusation, every microaggression was part of a larger wound. His own story would be the first case study. As these reforms rolled out, something began to shift. Airlines that had initially stayed quiet began reviewing their own practices. TSA issued a statement acknowledging gaps in equitable screening and announced an internal review. The FAA, impressed with Elijah's detailed reporting and leadership, asked him to lead a special task force aimed at addressing discrimination in transportation at a national level. It was more responsibility than he had expected, more than he had ever really wanted, but he accepted. "It's not just about airports," he said. "It's about the culture we allow to grow in public spaces." Meanwhile, the gate agent, who had ripped up Elijah's passport, Miss Rivers, had been officially terminated. Her case had become a warning across the industry, not just about racism, but about the cost of acting on prejudice. Elijah wasn't interested in ruining her life. He didn't need revenge. What he wanted was progress. He often thought about how different things might have been if she had just taken a moment to see him as a person, not a problem. Despite the emotional toll, Elijah found strength in the messages he received. Letters and emails poured in from travelers across the country, many of them Black, Latino, Middle Eastern, thanking him for standing up. Some said they finally felt seen. Others admitted they'd stopped flying altogether because of the anxiety. "You reminded me that I'm not crazy." One message read, "that how I'm treated isn't just in my head." Elijah saved every letter. He hadn't set out to become the face of a movement, but now that he was in it, he would make sure it mattered. He had seen the cracks in the system up close, and now, for the first time, he saw what it might look like to begin repairing them. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever walked up to a gate and been told, with a look or a word, that they didn't belong. Months later, Elijah Moore stood quietly near Gate 17 at the same airport where everything had begun. The terminal looked the same on the surface: busy travelers, overhead announcements, children tugging at tired parents, but something about the energy felt different. Gate agents greeted passengers with eye contact and clear, respectful communication. Uniformed staff from a variety of backgrounds worked side by side. On the wall nearby was a poster announcing the airline's new Equity in Action initiative, with bold letters underneath, "Every passenger matters." Elijah smiled faintly, not out of pride, but from the quiet satisfaction of knowing this hadn't been for nothing. His journey, which started in silence and ended in a storm, was now slowly shaping something better. He had returned not for another investigation, but for something much more personal: closure. The airline had invited him as a guest speaker for the launch of its new employee training program, the very one he had helped develop. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same company that once tore up his passport in front of dozens of people was now honoring him for helping to reshape their entire approach to customer service. Elijah had no illusions. It wasn't perfect. There were still incidents, still complaints, still deeply rooted bias in places people didn't want to admit. But there was also progress, and that mattered. As he walked through the terminal at Young black man wearing a pilot's uniform approached him. "Inspector Moore," the man asked, extending his hand. "I just wanted to say thank you. I've been flying for 3 years now. What you did, it opened doors for people like me. You made it easier for us to be seen, to be taken seriously." Elijah shook his hand, warmth rising in his chest. "You're the future of this industry," he said. "Don't let anyone make you feel like you're less than that." The launch event was small but meaningful. Employees gathered in a training room where Elijah spoke candidly about what happened, not to shame but to teach. He told them how even small actions, an extra ID check, a dismissive tone, a second look could leave deep wounds. He shared how he had once believed that change was impossible, that the system was too big, too old, too stubborn to bend. But now, standing in front of people who wanted to learn, who chose to be better, he no longer believed that. "Change isn't fast," he told them, "but it's possible. And every single one of you is part of it." After the speech, people lined up to thank him. A Latina gate agent said she used to be afraid to speak up when she saw others mistreated, but not anymore. A white baggage handler said his daughter had shown him the viral video and that it changed how he thought about race. "I didn't know how blind I'd been," he admitted. Elijah didn't need validation, but these moments told him what data never could. He had made an impact, not just on policy, but on people. As his return flight was called, Elijah made his way to the gate. The agent, a young woman with a calm smile, took his passport gently and scanned it without hesitation. "Have a safe flight, Mr. Moore," she said with warmth. He nodded, boarding the plane with a full heart. Looking out the window, he thought about how much had changed since that first day. What had begun as a quiet investigation had grown into a national conversation, into action, into hope, not just for him, but for every traveler who had ever been made to feel like a second-class citizen. As the plane lifted off the runway, Elijah leaned back in his seat. The skies stretched wide and open ahead of him, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was flying against the wind. He was flying towards something better. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to The Black Struggle for more powerful stories that deserve to be heard.